All right, so I just wanted to do a brief recap of last week's lecture on price controls. So if you remember, price control was a minimum or maximum price that the government by law decrees that a particular market can have. So there were two types of price controls that we looked at. We looked at price floors and price ceilings, where price floor, as the name would suggest, is the minimum price that you can charge for a good. Okay. And the price ceiling is the maximum price that you can charge for a good. So, for instance, a minimum wage is a price floor on the price of labor. Okay, so it's the minimum wage that you can get paid, essentially, the minimum wage that you can charge for your labor. All right. A price ceiling could be like a maximum price on a particular medicine. For instance, if they came out with a coronavirus vaccine, and they're like, okay, well, in order to make sure that it's not just the rich people getting the vaccine, we're going to limit the price to $100. Okay, that would be the maximum price that the maker of the medicine can sell it at, and they have their pluses and minuses. When there's a price floor, okay, that means that essentially you're going to have a surplus of the particular good. Okay, there's going to be a higher price than equilibrium if it's binding. Okay, and that means that more people want to sell it at the higher price, and less people want to buy it at a higher price. So you have goods that are unsold. Okay, if there's a price ceiling, so if we're talking about the vaccine case, if we limit the price to $100, well, what happens? People who wouldn't have bought the vaccine at $1,000 want to buy it at $100, right? But companies that don't want to sell it at $100 because it costs them more than $100 to make it might not. So then you'll have a shortage. Okay, so a binding price floor leads to a surplus. A binding price ceiling leads to a floor. Leads to a shortage. And I'll show you what that means graphically in a second when we go through these four graphs here. Okay, so there are two types of price controls, floors and ceilings, and depending on what they are, like what the price control that they set is, if it is it at $6, is it at $7, and where the equilibrium price is. So depending on if the floor is above the equilibrium price or not, determines whether it's binding or not. Okay, and we'll show that now. Okay, so there are two types of price controls, and there are two ways that they can interact with the equilibrium. They can either be binding or non-binding. Okay, and binding just means that the price control matters, whereas non-binding means it has no effect. Okay, so let's just show you exactly what I'm talking about. So what goes on the y-axis up here, I'm looking at the binding price ceiling up in the top left. The y-axis is price, right? It's always price. And the x-axis is quantity. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to fill that in everywhere. Okay. Okay, and which is the downward sloping line? That's demand. So the upward sloping one must be supply. Okay. All right, so now we have four graphs. All right, and then if I were to ask you what the equilibrium price is, you should be able to say it's wherever this is on the axis. So if this is like 3, then the equilibrium price is 3. This will be the equilibrium quantity. So I'm going to label them Q star and P star. So these are the equilibriums before the introduction of the price control. This is the regular old equilibrium. We have your supply equation, we have our demand equation. We solve them as a system like you would, any other equilibrium. Okay. All right. So now I have these four little labels over here. So this I'm going to line up somewhere with the axis, and that'll be my price floor. Okay, so if P star is 5 and the price floor is below 5, then I'm going to draw the line anywhere below P star. Okay. So since I did ceiling on the left, let's start with the binding price ceiling. Okay. So what is a ceiling? It's the maximum price that you can sell. Right? So if I had a ceiling that was above the equilibrium price, does that have an effect on the market? Okay, so if the coronavirus vaccine was going for $1,000 and then the government set a price ceiling of $1,200, will that price ceiling matter? No, because the maximum price is above the equilibrium price. Okay, so in order for the price ceiling to bind, in order for it to matter, it needs to be below the equilibrium price. Okay, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Oh, I don't want it crooked. I want to uncrooked it. Uncrooked. Okay. So the ceiling needs to be below the equilibrium price in order for it to bind. Okay. So what's the new equilibrium price? I'm going to draw that in red. New equilibrium price is going to be where the ceiling is, P, and I'm going to call it upper bar for the ceiling. Okay. What's the new equilibrium quantity? It's going to be here. Okay. Actually, let me erase that. Okay, so this is, I wanted to make it a little thinner because it's kind of hard to see. So this should be Q, okay? This is the new equilibrium quantity. I'm going to call it Q upper bar, just so that it's consistent with P upper bar. But what does Q upper bar correspond to? Okay, Q upper bar, this right here, okay, is the intersection between the supply curve and the price ceiling, right? So the new price ceiling must be the equilibrium by government law, right? If it's a binding price ceiling, the new price is the price ceiling, okay? So basically what happened is the government said you can't charge above $100 for a coronavirus vaccine, okay? So now the equilibrium price must be $100, okay? And with that, some suppliers whose costs were between the old equilibrium of $1,000 and the new equilibrium of $100 are going to say, oh, well, I can't afford to produce the coronavirus vaccine. I'll go out of business. So I'm going to leave this market. And you're going to have a contraction in supply. So this Q upper bar, you could also call QS. Okay, it's the intersection between the supply curve and the price ceiling, right? Over here, we have a quantity demanded, right? So if the price of the coronavirus vaccine goes down from $1,000 to $100, well, sure, a lot of people who wouldn't have bought the vaccine at $1,000 is like, hey, I can actually afford this now. It's definitely worth it for me. I'm going to try to buy the vaccine. Okay, so you're going to have a higher quantity demanded that you will have a quantity supplied. The quantity supplied is going to determine the overall equilibrium quantity. And why is that? Because if there's only 100 vaccines that people are willing to sell, even if there's 30,000 people who want to buy it, well, only 100 people will get the vaccine. They're going to get it at a lower price, but only a subset of the people who want it are going to get it. So you have a contraction relative to the old equilibrium, and you also have a lower number than the new quantity demanded. Okay, So the quantity demanded is higher than the old equilibrium quantity, and is also higher than the quantity supplied or the new equilibrium quantity. Okay, so more people want to buy it than did when the price was 1,000, and also less people want to sell it. So it's like a double whammy. So this difference here, QD minus QS, that's a shortage. Okay, that's the amount of people who want it and can't get it. Okay, so if I ask you what the shortage is, I don't want Q star minus Q upper bar or Q star minus QS, because Q star represents the people who bought it without the price control. Okay, whereas QD is the people who actually are standing in line who might get turned away. Okay, so you have essentially three quantities that matter with the price, with the binding price ceiling and the binding price floor. Okay, and then there was like one last part that I gave you for binding price ceiling, and that was to calculate the consumer, producer, and total surplus. So we found the equilibrium price, we found the equilibrium quantity, both before and after the binding price ceiling. Okay, we found the shortage, and then there is just consumer and producer surplus. Okay, so if I'm the producer, right, this is my cost, the supply line, right, and the price I'm charging for the good is the price ceiling, because that's the maximum I'm allowed to charge for it. So the producer surplus is going to be this in between here. Okay, this triangle from here to here. Okay, consumer surplus is going to be still going to be the difference for the people who demand and the price they pay, and they pay the price ceiling, P bar, because that's the new equilibrium price, but only this many people can get the good, right? So only a certain fraction of people are being able to buy the vaccine. So this trapezoid is now your consumer surplus. Okay, so and then this piece in here are people who used to buy the good, who used to get the virus, or excuse me, used to get the vaccine, but now cannot. Okay, so they are losing out on total surplus, and we call this triangle in here deadweight loss. Okay, so this is the total surplus is consumer surplus plus producer surplus. This is the deadweight loss, which is the difference in total surplus before the price ceiling and after the price ceiling. Okay, so this is the people who no longer get surplus that did before. Okay, and if you notice, if this was the old consumer surplus from this dotted line where my mouse is, and then below the demand equation, right? The area between the old equilibrium price P star and the demand equation. Well, consumer surplus might have increased because now we have this additional area between the dotted line and the price ceiling, but also there's some loss here up above the dotted line between Q bar and Q star for the consumers who don't buy anymore. So essentially, if the drop from P star to P upper bar outweighs the drop from Q star to Q upper bar, determines whether or not consumers are better off or worse off in this market. Okay, so if this area where my mouse is greater than this area, then there's an increase in consumer surplus because everybody who buys is getting a much better price, and individual consumer surplus is willingness to pay minus price paid. Okay, but if a significant lower number of people buy, then even though these people are getting more consumer surplus per good, there's just less people getting consumer surplus at all. So this might overweigh. It depends on the areas between this portion and this portion. Okay. On the other hand, you can definitely say that producer surplus is lower because producer surplus was this whole area where my mouse is circling, this triangle, and now it's just this triangle. And this triangle is very clearly lower because it has a lower height and a lower base. Okay, so the base was from Q star to the axis, and the height was from P star to the intercept. Now the height is from P bar to the intercept, which is clearly lower, and the base is from the axis to Q bar, which is also clearly lower. So producer surplus unambiguously went down. Consumer surplus might have increased. The way I drew it, it looks like it did increase, but it might also have decreased depending on the relative area of this portion right here to this portion right here. Okay. So overall, the market loses because there's a deadweight loss, but it's unclear whether consumers gained or lost. Definitely producers lost. Okay. All right, so this is once again, this is a binding ceiling because the maximum price is below the old equilibrium price. Okay. What about a non-binding ceiling? Oh, cursor on. What about a non-binding ceiling? Well, that's a lot easier. Okay. Non-binding ceiling, the maximum price you set is greater than the existing price, the equilibrium price. Okay. So you set a maximum price of 1,100. The equilibrium price is 1,000. Nothing happens. The equilibrium price is P star. Equilibrium quantity is still Q star. Producer surplus is still the area of this triangle here. Okay. Consumer surplus is still this triangle here. Okay. Okay, so if I bring the ceiling down, for instance, and it becomes binding, well then this area is now the producer surplus. This area is now the consumer surplus. This area is deadweight loss, of which, if we're like here, right, the deadweight loss is coming partially from producer surplus, partially from consumer surplus. Okay, but let's bring this back to where it's a non-binding price ceiling. The only reason I went through that little exercise is just so that you can see this graph as it was in the before state. Okay. All right, what about a binding price floor? Okay, well, should it be below? Well, no, right? That's a binding ceiling is below. If the price floor is the minimum price you pay and it's got to be binding, well, you want the minimum to be above what is currently being charged. Okay, if the minimum wage is $15 and the equilibrium wage is $13, well, the equilibrium wage has to meet the minimum wage now. Okay, so the new equilibrium price has to be 15. Okay, so let's go back and let's do our little drawing here. Okay, so what's the new equilibrium price? It's going to be P star, the price. I'm sorry, not P star. I want it to be P underbar. Go away. I want it to be P underbar. Okay, if it was German, it'd be P Unterbar. That was a bad joke. For those of you who know as little German as I do. Okay, so P underbar, the price floor, is now the new equilibrium price. What's the equilibrium quantity? Well, it's going to be where the floor intersects. Now it's the demand curve, right? It's just the one that it intersects first, okay, which will be demand curve. Okay, so I'm going to call this Q underbar. Okay, so this is going to be equal to, now it's Q D, okay, because it intersects the demand curve first. Okay, then there's a third quantity over here, which is the number of people who want to sell the good, quantity supplied. Okay, but that's not the equilibrium quantity. Equilibrium quantity is Q underbar. Okay, and then if I ask you what the amount of surplus, and I'm not talking consumer surplus or producer or total surplus, I'm talking surplus in the sense of goods that are that people want to sell, but there's nobody to buy it for. Well, then you're going to have QS minus QD. That's your surplus. Okay, and it's important to keep track of, if I say consumer, producer, total surplus, that's what that means. If I'm asking for surplus here, I want the quantity supplied versus quantity demanded. Okay, so you should be able to figure that out from context. If there's a price floor, then and I ask you for just the surplus, not the consumer producer surplus, then I want quantity supplied minus quantity demanded. Okay, so why is there a surplus at all? Well, if you increase the price, there's going to be suppliers who want to increase their own output, and if they're not in the market already, they want to enter the market. Okay, so if the price rises, more people want to sell more things, right? So that'll increase the quantity supplied, but the quantity demanded is going to go down. It's going to go from Q star to QD, right? This is a decrease in quantity demanded, right? It used to be here, now it's here. Why is that? Well, the price rose, right? So only the highest willingness to pay people are still going to want to buy the good. Okay, so only these people with their willingness to pay are going to want to buy the good, and these people are now going to leave the market. Okay, so you have more suppliers than you did, or more quantity supplied than you did without the price floor, and less quantity demanded. So there's going to be a surplus. Things are going to be sitting on the aisle. Okay. And then just like with the binding price ceiling, it's more or less the same exercise. Your consumer surplus is now going to be this triangle here between the demand curve and the new price. Okay, so this will be your consumer surplus is going to be here. Okay, your producer surplus is going to be this trapezoid between the supply curve and the price. So this is your producer surplus. Okay. And then this is your deadweight loss in this area here. I'm just going to do DW for DWL. Okay, this is your deadweight loss in this triangle here. Okay, so there's going to be a loss in total surplus because less goods are being sold, right? So some of that loss in total surplus will come from consumer surplus. Some of it will come from producer surplus, but they also gain a piece, right? Just like they did the binding price ceiling. But overall, there's going to be a loss in total surplus causing a deadweight loss. Okay, so individual producers are going to gain more, provided that they produce, because they're able to charge a higher price, but they're selling less goods, so they're also going to lose this chunk here where my mouse is kind of hovering over from the deadweight loss. Okay, so if this area over here is higher than this area down here, well then producer surplus increases. Okay, consumer surplus definitely decreases because less people are buying the good, right? The Q star moved from equilibrium quantity moved from Q star to Q underbar, right? From here to here. So less people are buying the good, and they're also getting less individual consumer surplus because the price is now higher. Okay. And then just one more logistical point. So if I wanted to find this point here or this point here in order to calculate consumer surplus in this case and producer surplus in this case, okay, all I need to do is plug in this Q underbar or Q overbar in for the supply equation or the demand equation. Okay. So supply equation over here and demand equation over here. So basically, I'm just looking for the intersection between Q bar, or the equilibrium quantity, and the demand in this case, and Q underbar and the supply in this case. Okay. So then once you have that, you have all 4 points in order to calculate the area of this trapezoid here. Okay. And then you just add up consumer surplus, which is just the area of a triangle, so you should be able to do that. Producer surplus, which would be 1/2 height 1 plus height 2 times base. If you add those up, you get total surplus. And then the new total surplus the old total surplus minus the new total surplus will be the deadweight loss, and you can double check that by finding the area of this triangle here and seeing does that equal old total surplus minus new total surplus. If it does, you're golden. Okay. And then finally, a non-binding price floor is when you set the minimum price below the equilibrium price. All right, so that's pretty much the sum of everything from last lecture. If you have questions when you're doing the homework, let me know. As always, I'm here for office hours, Wednesdays from 8 to 8:45. Please come if you're having any questions. There's been nobody coming the last 3 weeks, and I doubt that nobody has any questions about this course. So please respect my time and come, and if you can, don't ask me questions if you're not coming to office hours. It's kind of disrespectful, I think. But I'll still answer them. But please, if you have questions, come to office hours because it's, I'm making this time for you guys, and I feel like it's a resource you're not really using. All right. Anyway, on to elasticity.